The low hum of the spaceship echoed through the cold, empty corridors, sending a slight chill down my spine as I made my way to the central control room. This wasn't your typical sci-fi experience. No sleek, shiny tech or super-fast interstellar travel. No, this was the kind of spacecraft that made you wonder if the crew had been using duct tape and hoped to keep things together. The temperature was dropping, and the control panel was flashing red. Fatal cooling malfunction, which, needless to say, wasn't something you wanted to see when you're 30 light-years from Earth and stuck with a temperamental alien. I'd stumbled into this mess a few hours ago, a mix of bad luck and even worse timing. See, I was just a regular human, well, regular by Earth standards, when I found myself accidentally crossing paths with an exiled alien woman on the run from her own kind. Yep, her name's Zara, and while I'm not exactly sure why she's so important, I'm guessing it has something to do with her being a fugitive. The whole, I'm not supposed to be here thing. You know, the usual. Anyway, our first interaction, a misunderstanding over a random teleportation device, a malfunctioning portal, and one very confused human. The last time I saw Zara, she was ransacking the spaceship's engine room like it was a Black Friday sale. Apparently, she had borrowed the ship from a group of bounty hunters, and now, because of her brilliant piloting skills, it was on a one-way trip to the frozen depths of space. Oh, and by the way, we were supposed to be dead right now because the ship's fuel tank was damaged. But hey, I survived. Not sure how, but I did. Now, here I was, in the freezing cold, wandering around looking for the alien who seemed to have a knack for messing things up. The temperature was plummeting, and I could see my breath in the air as I pulled my jacket tighter around me. It was one of those awkward moments where you realize that, yeah, you're not supposed to be here. Not supposed to be in this freezing, broken-down spaceship, and definitely not supposed to be anywhere near an alien woman who could, at any moment, flip out and throw me into deep space with one wrong word. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard her. "Human!" she called out from the shadows, her voice sharp and commanding. I spun around, already regretting my decision to follow her onto this chaotic spacecraft. There she was, standing in the doorway of what I now assumed was the living quarters, her silvery skin glinting in the dim emergency lights. "Human! Come here!" she ordered, her expression a mix of annoyance and something else. Couldn't tell. Something I didn't really want to get into, considering how much she liked to throw things at me whenever I asked questions. "Now, you, come here." What's going on?" I asked, taking a tentative step forward. "It's freezing in here. Shouldn't we be, I don't know, fixing the ship? Or like, finding a heat source or—" "Shut up, human. We're freezing," she snapped, cutting me off. Her voice, though icy and a little terrifying, had this weird edge to it, like she was holding something back. "Get in my bed now." At that, I blinked, not quite sure if I had heard her right. Bed? We were stranded in space, surrounded by a malfunctioning ship, and she wanted me to, what? Climb into her bed? My mouth worked for a second, but no words came out. Instead, my brain was busy processing the ridiculousness of the entire situation. A freezing cold spaceship, a malfunctioning cooling system, and a very angry alien telling me to get into her bed. Okay, maybe I had gotten used to the whole alien thing by now, but this was a new level of weird. Your bed," I stammered, not sure if I should be concerned or just go with it. It wasn't like I had a lot of other options. The whole ship was cold. I was cold. My teeth were starting to chatter from the chill in the air. Zara's eyes narrowed at me. "Yes, my bed. I don't care what you think. The temperature is dropping fast, and the cooling system is about to fail. We're going to freeze to death if you don't listen to me. Now get in, human." Took me a second to process that. She sounded so frustrated, which honestly was a bit odd coming from her. Most of the time, she was either yelling at me or making some sarcastic remark about how inferior humans were. And now, she was actually worried. Maybe she was just cold. Maybe she was just trying to maintain some sort of power dynamic. Or maybe she just didn't want to admit that she might actually need help. Whatever the case, I wasn't about to argue. I didn't even want to imagine what would happen if I didn't follow her orders. But getting into her bed? That was definitely not something I had anticipated when I'd agreed to help her escape from her alien enemies a couple of days ago. Still, I had no choice. I made my way past her, trying to act like I wasn't completely out of my element. Zara, for all her faults, was no dummy. She'd already figured out how to keep the two of us alive in a collapsing spaceship, and this was just part of the plan, I think. As I entered her quarters, her bedroom, for lack of a better word, I was hit with an odd mixture of cold and warmth. The bed was large and alien in design, unlike anything you'd find on Earth, and the sheets seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. It looked like something out of a high-end space hotel, the kind you'd find on a luxury cruise to a planet far, far away. Only, with a giant malfunctioning spaceship instead of a luxury cruise. "Sit," Zara ordered, pushing me toward the bed with a little more force than necessary. "We need to conserve heat. It's not about comfort. It's about survival." I swallowed, hesitating for a moment before I slowly sat down on the edge of the bed. Zara, to her credit, didn't try to force me to do anything else. Instead, she climbed in next to me, her silvery skin glowing faintly as she moved closer. Her eyes were still cold, but there was a hint of something else beneath the surface. I was about to ask her what the hell she was doing when she suddenly spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. "Human, if you want to survive this, you'll need to get closer. It's the only way to stay warm." At that, my heart skipped a beat. This wasn't what I had expected at all. I thought we were about to freeze to death, but now there was a different kind of tension in the air. And somehow it wasn't just about the cold. I hesitated, glancing over at Zara. Her eyes were focused on me now, a soft glow emanating from her skin as she leaned back against the cool metal frame of the bed. It was weird. Not because she was an alien, but because, this was the first time I'd seen this side of her. The serious, almost fragile side. She wasn't yelling at me. She wasn't threatening to throw me out into space. She was actually, dare I say it, concerned. And that, quite frankly, was throwing me off. I shifted uncomfortably, not sure what to do with my hands. Was this a survival thing? Or did she actually want me to? "Human," she said, her voice low, the edge of irritation still there but softened. "I am not asking you for comfort. I am asking for survival. You are cold. I am cold. And if we don't work together, we will freeze to death before we reach the nearest habitable planet." "Right, yeah, I get that," I replied, trying to focus on the seriousness of the situation. But it was hard, really hard, because her proximity was, distracting. I mean, I've never been great with women in the first place, but throw in the fact that this woman could literally disintegrate me with a thought, and now she wanted me to snuggle up next to her? My brain wasn't quite keeping up. I'll move closer then," I said, fumbling for the right words. Zara didn't even look at me when I slid over. Instead, she kept her eyes straight ahead, staring into the cold darkness of the ship. Her body language was stiff, like she was forcing herself to maintain control, as if she didn't want to admit that she, too, was affected by the situation. But I noticed something then, just as I positioned myself next to her. A fraction of an inch away, her breath hitched. "Is everything okay?" I asked, a little surprised. I didn't want to pry, but I could feel the change in the atmosphere. The earlier tension was shifting into something else. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she pulled the sheets up around both of us. The heat from her body began to seep into the cold space between us, and I couldn't help but notice the way her shoulder brushed against mine. Her skin was warm, warmer than anything I'd ever felt in my life. And yet, the shiver running down my spine wasn't entirely from the cold. "You should not have followed me," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a statement, but it sounded more like an apology. "This ship is a mess. I shouldn't have brought you into this." I blinked, trying to process what she'd just said. "What do you mean? You didn't bring me here. I kind of just ended up here, you know?" I added with a small chuckle, hoping to lighten the mood. Zara shot me a look, one that I couldn't quite decipher. A mix of frustration and something softer, maybe? "I never asked for your help, human, but I needed it." She paused, her eyes flickering to mine. It's complicated. I swallowed, feeling the awkwardness between us stretch. Yeah, no kidding. Being trapped on a malfunctioning spaceship with a fugitive alien who's basically just using me as a heating pad? Very complicated. For a moment, the silence between us stretched. And then, against my expectations, Zara let out a soft, almost involuntary laugh. It was quiet, but it was definitely there. You have a strange sense of humor for a human, she said, her voice warming just a little bit. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just shrugged. Guess I have to make the best of it. She turned toward me slightly then, her expression softening. I suppose? But humor will not save us from the cold. True. I guess she was right. I had been hoping for some sort of miracle. Maybe a ship-wide heating system to magically kick in or a sudden burst of warmth from the galaxy's stars. But here I was, stuck in this ridiculous situation. And that's when it hit me. We were really close now. Like, so close I could feel the heat of her body pressed against mine. I could smell her. Some strange mix of alien spices and something sharp, metallic, and almost electrifying. I looked down at the bed, at us, and the reality of the situation hit me all at once. This wasn't just about survival anymore. At least it wasn't for me. There was something about this alien woman, this fugitive, this enigma, that made my heart beat just a little faster. The cold was still there, of course, but the warmth between us, it felt different. And, well, I had to admit I was kind of enjoying it. There, I said it. But before I could say anything else, I felt her shift beside me, and a small, uneasy silence fell over the room. You know, I began, trying to push the awkwardness aside. For someone who's constantly throwing things at me and threatening to eject me into space, you don't suck at this whole keeping warm thing. Zara shot me another glance. This one a mix of amusement and annoyance. I do not have time for your jokes, human. But there was a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. And I am not keeping you warm, as you call it. You are simply not freezing anymore. Sure. I'll just tell myself that, I said, leaning back a little more comfortably into the bed. But I could feel the heat between us, and there was no denying it. The more I relaxed, the more I found myself enjoying her company. Even if it was only because, we were about to die from freezing to death unless we figured this out. And that's when it happened. Zara, in a moment of vulnerability, or maybe just sheer cold frustration, looked at me again. Her eyes weren't as sharp as before, and for once, there was no sarcasm, no biting edge to her words. You're strange, human, she said quietly, her tone much softer now. I laughed. Hey, that's my line. She didn't laugh back. Instead, she leaned a little closer to me, and I felt her breath against my neck. Faint, warm. You think I'm strange? She asked, her voice low, the hint of something deeper in her gaze. Something I hadn't expected. Yeah, but you're kind of growing on me, I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Zara didn't respond immediately. For a moment, we just sat there, the tension between us thickening. And then, to my utter surprise, she leaned in even closer, until I could feel the heat from her body radiating against mine. For a moment, everything felt still. And then, without warning, her lips pressed against mine. The kiss was brief, but it hit me like a lightning bolt. I didn't know what I'd expected, but it definitely wasn't this. It wasn't like the usual awkward, fumbling moments I had with humans, where there was always some hesitation, some uncertainty. No, this was different. Her lips warm, soft, and yet with an undeniable sense of urgency. Pressed against mine for just a heartbeat before she pulled back, her breath hitching as if she had surprised herself too. The room seemed to freeze in that instant. The cold air outside the bed now felt miles away. All I could focus on was the thudding of my heart, the faint sound of her breathing, and the overwhelming sensation that this was somehow right. Zara's eyes were wide, her usual defiance replaced with something unreadable, something I couldn't place. She pulled away slightly, as if giving herself space to breathe, but her gaze didn't shift from mine. You don't understand, human, she said softly, her voice shaky but still commanding. Her alien beauty, her silver skin, the way her eyes glowed in the dim light. It was almost too much to take in. She was an alien. But right now, she felt more real than anyone I'd ever met. "I think I do," I replied, my voice a little rougher than I intended. There was a strange sense of calm in the chaos, a sense that maybe we weren't just two beings stuck on a broken spaceship anymore. Maybe, just maybe, we were something else. At least, I think I understand enough. Her lips parted as if she were about to say something, but then she closed her mouth, her jaw tightening. She looked away for a second, almost like she was trying to regain control, as though being vulnerable was the last thing she ever wanted to be. But the warmth between us remained. Despite everything, the alien tech, the freezing temperatures, the malfunctioning ship, the intimacy felt real. Zara shifted again, but this time, there was no anger in her movement. She didn't shove me away or give me the cold shoulder like usual. Instead, she let out a quiet sigh, and I saw the subtle drop of tension in her posture. "I'm not used to this," she muttered. And it was so quiet I almost didn't catch it, but I did. She wasn't used to this. Not to warmth. Not to affection. Used to what? I asked, leaning in slightly. "You mean this?" I gestured between us, my voice quieter now, almost unsure. She met my gaze again, her eyes softening ever so slightly. "Used to needing someone." I hadn't expected that answer, and it stopped me cold. "Needing someone? Zara?" I started, but she stopped me with a hand. A gentle touch this time, a far cry from the aggressive gestures she'd given me before. "No," she said, her voice firm but with a hint of vulnerability. "I don't need anyone. Not like this. But you, human, you're different. I didn't expect you to be different." The way she said it made me feel like we were both standing on the edge of something neither of us had planned for. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about something else, something deeper. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't want to leave this spaceship. Not yet. Not with her. "I'm not different, Zara. I'm just here," I said, my words coming out slower, more deliberate. I could feel my own walls starting to crack too. "But maybe that's enough right now. Maybe we don't need to have it all figured out. Maybe we just need to stay warm." She studied me for a long time, her brow furrowed slightly, like she was trying to decipher me. But there was something else in her eyes too. Something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't fear or anger or even the usual skepticism. It was something closer to trust. "Stay warm," she repeated softly, like the words tasted unfamiliar. Then, her voice softened even further. "I never thought I'd hear you say that." I smiled at her, trying to offer something comforting in the midst of all the chaos. "Well, I'm full of surprises." Zara blinked. Then, without warning, she moved closer again, her body brushing against mine. Her eyes fluttered shut, and she exhaled a slow breath, as if she was allowing herself to let go for once. The cold wasn't so bad now, not when she was this close. For a moment we just lay there, the silence between us not uncomfortable, but full of a strange kind of tension. There was no more talk of survival, no more jokes. Just two beings, in the middle of a freezing ship, trying to find warmth. Not just from the cold, but from each other. And then, as if the universe had conspired to give us a brief moment of peace, the lights flickered. For a second, I thought we were doomed to sit in eternal darkness, the ship finally giving up on us, but instead, faint, distant humming started to fill the room. "Did you hear that?" I asked, pulling away slightly, trying to listen for any sign of what was happening. Zara's expression shifted, her brow furrowing. "Yes, the system, it's rebooting. The ship might not be as dead as I thought." I sighed in relief, but then, the weight of her body pressed against mine again, and I found myself not caring so much about the ship's recovery. Zara shifted once more, this time more deliberately. She moved her face closer, almost imperceptibly, until her lips brushed against my ear. Her breath sent a shiver down my spine, but it wasn't from the cold this time. It was something else, something warmer. "You've Survived longer than I thought you would, she murmured, her voice rougher now, the earlier tension giving way to something else. Desire, maybe? Or maybe it was just the physical proximity, the closeness that neither of us knew how to handle. But it didn't matter. The ship could burn down around us and I wouldn't care. I felt my heart race, my body responding to her proximity, to the undeniable chemistry between us. I couldn't deny it anymore. I leaned in, my lips just barely brushing against hers. Maybe we should survive this together, I whispered. She paused for a long moment before closing the space between us. And when her lips met mine again, it was no longer just a survival instinct, no longer just the heat of the moment. It was something real. The kiss deepened, soft but urgent, as though neither of us wanted to admit the strange pull that had formed between us. Zara's lips moved against mine with a sense of newfound curiosity, and I found myself responding in kind, my hand instinctively reaching up to touch her shoulder. Her skin, still warm despite the frigid atmosphere of the ship, sent a surge of heat coursing through me. For a moment it felt like nothing else mattered. The malfunctioning ship, the freezing temperatures, the danger of being trapped in the vastness of space. It all faded into the background. There was just the two of us, in this small, dimly lit bed, and it felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced. I pulled away slowly, our foreheads resting together as we caught our breath. The quiet was almost suffocating, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only comes when you've shared something intense, something you weren't sure how to process just yet. Zara's eyes opened first, locking with mine. She didn't look away this time. Her gaze was different now, softer, less guarded. And for the first time, I saw the vulnerability in her eyes, something that she'd kept hidden behind her tough, alien exterior. She exhaled slowly, her breath warm against my cheek. You? She whispered, and I could feel the tremor in her voice. You make things more difficult, human. I chuckled softly, despite the weight of the situation. I thought that was the point. Her lips twitched into a fleeting smile, the first real one-eyed scene in a long while. It wasn't a big, victorious grin or a sarcastic smirk. It was genuine. It made my heart race even more than the kiss had. You should go, she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. Before I change my mind. Change your mind, I repeated, confused. Wasn't this what she wanted? Weren't we both trying to survive? I could feel my pulse quickening, my body still humming with the energy of the kiss. Zara's eyes flickered down to her hands, which were tightly clutched at the bedsheets. She didn't look at me for a long moment, and when she did, her expression had shifted again. There was a quiet intensity behind it, something almost like fear. This isn't supposed to happen, she said quietly. It shouldn't be like this. She stopped herself, as if she realized that whatever she had been about to say didn't make any sense, at least not in this moment. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. I'm not meant to need someone, human. I don't need anyone. Her words stung a little more than I expected. There it was again, her insistence on being alone, on keeping her distance from everyone. I could see now that it wasn't just some act, some bravado she put on. It was real. She had spent so long alone, running, hiding, fighting against everyone around her. Maybe she'd convinced herself that she didn't need anyone, but I wasn't so sure anymore. You're wrong, I said quietly, my voice firm despite the uncertainty in my chest. You do need someone. We all do. You just don't want to admit it. Zara's eyes flashed with something, defiance, maybe, but also a trace of doubt. For a brief moment, I thought she might snap at me again, but instead, she just stared at me, her chest rising and falling with the slow, steady rhythm of her breath. I don't want to need anyone, she said, and her voice was so quiet now, almost like a confession. I can't afford to. Her words hung in the air between us like a cloud. And it was then that I realized just how much of her life had been spent running. Running from her past, from her enemies, from the feelings that now seemed to be surfacing. She had been forced into a position where the only thing she could rely on was herself. I shifted, closing the small distance between us again. This time, I didn't lean in for a kiss. I just rested my forehead against hers, letting the warmth between us speak for itself. Felt like the only thing I could do. "You don't have to keep running, Zara," I said softly. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. Not if you don't want to." For a long moment, she didn't respond. I could feel her struggle with it, struggling with the idea of letting someone else in, of letting herself be vulnerable. But then, slowly, her arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer. I could feel her tense at first, but then she let go, the tension easing out of her body as she settled against me. Her head rested on my shoulder, and for the first time, she felt like someone to me. Not just a stranger or a fugitive, but a woman who had spent far too long in isolation. "I've never been this close to anyone," she murmured against my skin, her voice thick with emotion. "And I don't know how to do this." I closed my eyes, holding her just a little tighter. "It's okay," I whispered. "You don't have to figure it out all at once." We stayed there for a while, the silence wrapping around us like a blanket, keeping out the cold, keeping out the rest of the universe. The ship was still malfunctioning, still on its course toward God knows where. But right now, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the warmth between us, the way our bodies fit together, and the way our hearts seemed to beat in sync. Eventually, the hum of the ship became louder, signaling that the systems were slowly coming back online. The lights flickered once more, brighter this time, and the ship seemed to come back to life, at least in small increments. But in that moment, neither of us cared about the ship's repairs. All I could think about was the woman in my arms, and the strange, undeniable pull that had brought us together. "You're not as bad as I thought, human?" Zara said, her voice muffled against my chest. But there was a hint of something almost affectionate in her tone. I chuckled, feeling my heart settle into a steady rhythm. "I get that a lot." She pulled away just slightly, enough to look up at me with a half smile. I don't know what's going to happen after this, but..." I brushed a lock of hair from her face, my thumb grazing her cheek. "It's okay. We'll figure it out, one step at a time." And as the ship continued its slow recovery, I realized something important, that no matter what happened next, I wasn't in this alone anymore. Neither of us was. We had each other, and that was enough. The ship's hum was a constant in the background, almost like a heartbeat. Steady, persistent, and reminding us that, despite everything, we were still alive. The freezing temperatures had receded, thanks to the warmth we were sharing, and the occasional flickers of light from the ship system coming back online felt almost like a sign of hope. But honestly, in that moment it didn't matter. All that mattered was the steady rhythm of Zara's breath against my chest, the warmth of her in my arms, and the strange, unspoken understanding between us. She shifted again, pulling away just enough to look at me with those glowing eyes that were now softer, warmer. There was a vulnerability in them I hadn't noticed before. The sharpness was gone, replaced by something gentler, something almost afraid. "You're not going to leave, are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a fragility to her words, a tremor I wasn't used to hearing from her. Zara had always been so sure, so indestructible. But now her usual confidence seemed a little shaken. I shook my head, holding her a little tighter, as if that simple gesture could offer reassurance. "I'm not going anywhere, Zara. You're stuck with me." She let out a soft breath, and for a moment, I thought she might pull away, might go back to being the distant, cold fugitive I had met earlier. But she didn't. Instead, she nestled closer to me, the tension between us dissolving just a little more. Her head rested against my chest again, and this time it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a connection, something real. "You're right," she murmured, her voice thick with something that might have been exhaustion or relief. "I can't keep running." I didn't say anything, just let her words settle between us. There was no need for more. Her admission was all I needed to hear. The ship's lights flickered again, the hum of the engines growing stronger as the power systems regained their full functionality. The temperature in the room began to rise, a subtle, but undeniable sign that we were no longer in immediate danger. But even as the ship began to stabilize, I didn't want to move. I didn't want to break the fragile moment we had created between us. Everything felt suspended, like we were in our own little world, far removed from the chaos and danger of the universe outside. Zara lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine again, and for a brief second, I saw something I hadn't expected: softness. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And for a split second, I thought she might say something more, something deeper, but she didn't. Instead, she stood up, her movements fluid but guarded. She stepped away from me, her back turned, but I could still feel the weight of her presence in the room. It was strange, like we had just crossed some invisible line, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. "We need to get to the control room," Zara said, her voice steady again, like the usual walls had reformed, and she was the fierce, defiant alien leader I had come to know. "The ship's systems are still unstable. If we don't recalibrate the engines, we'll drift off course. It won't matter if we're warm now if we're lost in the middle of nowhere." Couldn't help but chuckle. Of course, the moment things started to get personal, it was like flipping a switch. But somehow I didn't mind. This was Zara. She wasn't going to let me off the hook that easily, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what I needed. "You're right," I said, sitting up and stretching, trying to shake off the lingering warmth of the bed and get my bearings. "I'm pretty sure I didn't sign up for being stranded in deep space with a freezing, malfunctioning ship." She gave me a look, her usual sharpness returning. "You didn't sign up for anything. You're just a human caught in the wrong place at the wrong time." I stood up and grinned, letting the lightness of the situation sink in. "I think that's pretty much my life story." Zara rolled her eyes, but there was something almost affectionate in the gesture. She turned toward the door, her posture more commanding than I had seen since we first met. "Come on, then. If we're going to survive this, we might as well do it together. And you might want to keep up, human. I don't plan on babysitting." "Oh, I'm sure you won't," I said with a wink, following her out the door. "But I'll try not to slow you down." The ship's hallways were still eerily quiet as we walked, the low hum of the engines the only sound breaking the silence. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was still off. The calm between us felt fragile, like a delicate thing that might shatter at any moment. But then again, wasn't that part of the thrill? Being on the edge of something unknown, something unpredictable? Zara led the way with confidence, her long strides carrying her purposefully down the corridor. I followed close behind, my thoughts racing, and despite everything that had happened, the kiss, the sudden closeness between us, the shared vulnerability, I couldn't help but admire the way she moved. Her energy was magnetic, and I felt drawn to her in a way I couldn't explain. We reached the control room in no time. Zara immediately went to work, flipping switches and typing commands into the console, her eyes flicking over the readouts with practiced ease. I watched her for a moment, mesmerized by the way she operated, the intensity of her focus. She was in her element here, no longer the alien fugitive, but the brilliant, capable individual who had been running the show all along. "Everything's still operational, but it's going to take some time to get the systems fully stable," she said without looking at me, her fingers flying over the panel. "We'll need to reroute power from the auxiliary systems to the main engines, but that'll drain the reserve." I stepped closer, leaning against the console beside her. "How long do we have?" She glanced at me for a moment, her eyes flicking to mine. "We'll have a few hours before we lose power completely. And if we don't get the main engines back online by then, we'll be at the mercy of whatever star system is closest." Which, frankly, isn't looking promising. I nodded, trying to process everything. "So it's up to us to save the ship. No pressure." Zara smirked, her lips curling ever so slightly. "For a human, you're not entirely useless." I chuckled. "I try my best." We worked together in silence after that, each of us focused on the tasks at hand. As I assisted her with rerouting power, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in this for more than just survival. Somewhere between the cold and the chaos, somewhere in the way our bodies fit together in that bed, we had crossed a line. and I wasn't sure where it was taking us. But I was starting to think that maybe it didn't matter. Hours passed in the control room as we worked tirelessly, rerouting power, recalibrating the engines, and checking the systems. Zara was in her element, her focused determination driving us forward. But every now and then, she would glance at me, her eyes softer than before, like the harshness was slowly wearing off. And with each fleeting glance, I could feel the tension building between us once again. The hum of the engines grew louder, the lights brightening steadily. The temperature had returned to a comfortable level, and the atmosphere on the ship felt less like a tomb and more like a living, breathing space. It was a small victory, but it was enough to make us both realize we were pulling this off. We were going to survive. Zara wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead and let out a deep breath, the first sign of relief I'd seen from her since we started. "I think we've done it," she said, her voice still a bit rough, but full of satisfaction. "The engines are back online. We'll be able to reach a nearby star system and get help." I leaned back against the console, trying to suppress a grin. "Well, it looks like we make a pretty good team after all." She glanced at me again, a flicker of something passing across her features. "I suppose you're not as useless as I thought." I raised an eyebrow. "I'll take that as a compliment." The room fell into a brief silence, but this time, it wasn't tense. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet we had shared earlier, but a kind of peaceful acknowledgement of what we had just accomplished. And, if I was being honest, of what we had become to each other. Zara took a step toward me, her movements slower now, as though the gravity of the situation, and perhaps our newfound connection, was settling in. Her gaze softened, her lips slightly parted, like she was about to say something important. But before she could speak, the ship's intercom crackled to life with a voice we hadn't heard before. "Control room to Zara. This is Commander Kieran of the Roshar Coalition. We've detected your distress signal and are en route to assist. Stand by for our arrival." I felt my heart skip a beat. It was really happening. Help was coming. Zara froze for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she turned back to me, her eyes locking with mine. There was a brief flicker of uncertainty, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. She squared her shoulders, standing tall, her usual confidence returning. "Well, I guess that's our cue," she said, her voice back to its cool, authoritative tone. "You'd better get ready. The rescue team will be here soon." "Are you sure you want to face them?" I asked, unable to hide the concern in my voice. "After everything we've been through?" Zara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at me for a long moment, her gaze softening as she seemed to consider the question. Finally, she sighed. "I don't know. I've spent so long running from everything, from everyone, that I forgot what it feels like to have someone by my side, to not be alone." She looked down for a moment, her eyes closing, and when she opened them again, there was something different in her expression, a kind of acceptance. "But maybe it's time I stopped running." I stepped closer to her, the distance between us closing again in that quiet, unspoken way. "You don't have to run anymore, Zara. Not if you don't want to." Her lips curled into a small, genuine smile, something rare and real, and for the first time, it wasn't guarded. "I think I'm starting to believe that." Before I could say anything else, the doors to the control room slid open, revealing the glowing corridor beyond. Zara straightened, her posture still that of the fierce alien commander she had always been. But now, there was something different about her. Something warmer. Something human. "You coming?" she asked, her voice light but with an undertone of seriousness. "We've got a rescue team to meet." I smiled, feeling a weight I didn't realize I had been carrying lift off my shoulders. "Yeah, I'm coming." As we walked out of the control room together, side by side, the ship no longer felt like a cold, desolate place. It felt like a home, one we had built together in the midst of chaos. And for the first time in a long while, I realized that the future didn't have to be something I was afraid of. With Zara, maybe, just maybe, I could face it. We stood at the ship's docking bay, waiting for the rescue team to arrive, the stars twinkling outside the viewports. The cold of space had receded, but the warmth between us was something that would last. And as we waited for the next chapter of our lives to begin, I knew that no matter what happened next, we weren't just survivors anymore. We were something more. Zara glanced at me, her eyes softening again, and this time, I knew it wasn't just the result of surviving a near-death experience together. It was something real. "Maybe this isn't the end," she said quietly, her voice almost wistful. I took her hand, squeezing it gently, my heart full in a way it hadn't been in ages. "No, it's just the beginning." And for the first time, I believed it.